live from the Nasdaq market site in sunny Times Square. I'm Ben Mellon of Corporate Secretary Magazine. Thank you for joining us today for the Nasdaq exclusive discussion, which is entitled How Corporate Boards Can Tackle Cybersecurity. Here to discuss it with me today are our guests, Governor Tom Ridge, who's chairman of Ridge Global, Peter Gleason, CEO of NACD, and David Strandberg, chief counsel with Nasdaq. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Governor Ridge, if I could start with you. How has board-level awareness and understanding of cybersecurity risk changed over the last few years?
Well, I'll tell you, I think that's a great way to start this conversation. Thanks for having us on.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate this. It's a really important issue. My friend Peter and NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, took a survey of board members for publicly traded companies. And it was interesting. Only 19% of those surveys had a high level of confidence as to their understanding of cybersecurity related issues, which really set the foundation for our collaboration with Carnegie Mellon University to raise that level of awareness through an online education program, which is really designed not to turn them into technologists, but to take a look at the array of risk, they take a look at cybersecurity and embed in that notion, this is a risk that has to be managed aggressively, particularly on, and again, NACD, it's the premier corporate governance entity across the board. And in collaboration with them, what can we do to give these board members more knowledge and to be better equipped to interact with their IT teams, their CISOs, but more importantly, to interact with the management, because ultimately, the fiduciary duty to protect the enterprise from the risk, and it's a global risk, rests with the management and the board. And when only 19% of them have a feeling of confidence that their own personal knowledge and ability to interact, I think that speaks to a need for this online education program. So in collaboration with them and CMU, we've laid it out there in a way we think it's very convenient. I'm on a couple public boards. They're really talented people. They're very busy. Some of them don't have a chance to take 2 or 3 days to go here or there. It's a 16-hour program. Do it at your own pace. When you're done and you successfully complete it, you get this tangible certificate from Carnegie Mellon, premier global cybersecurity university in the world, that says you've taken the course, you passed the test, and we think you'll be better equipped to be better board members.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, I mean, Peter, if I could just turn over to you, what are some of the key challenges that directors face in getting to grips with these, often terrifying kind of issues?
Well, from a macro perspective, the biggest challenge is the education component, and that's why we teamed up with Governor Ridge and Carnegie Mellon. But if you think about the pace of change that's happening in the cyber world in terms of the attacks and just how they've morphed over the years, we went from simple credit card information to work stoppages to what's next. And keeping up with that pace of change, understanding the lexicon, understanding how the dialogue changes even within the boardroom and how we're going to discuss this, keeping up with the pace of change as it relates to the lexicon that the chief information officer comes to you with, that's a tremendous amount of information that people have to absorb in a very quick period of time. So the idea behind our course was, let's get a baseline level of understanding for corporate directors so that they can have that dialogue, they can ask the key questions to the management team and ensure that they are overseeing the protection mechanisms that the company has put in place to protect the entity.
And as you say, the awareness is definitely a concerning factor if you have only 19%, you were saying, of directors who are kind of seem to be
that's the high level of confidence that they know what they're doing. The flip side of that is only 15% are actually telling us that they're comfortable with the information they're getting from management. So you've got almost a translation issue that has to happen. And when you have a board of directors that hasn't been steeped in this, that isn't their, they're not technologists, to refrain what Governor Ridge said, you've got to get them to a point where they can have the conversation, they can ask the tough questions to ensure that they are overseeing this process.
And David, we're talking here about getting information from management. Obviously, one of the key solutions that people talk about, a good practice, is for the board to have interactions with the CIO and the CISO. How often should they be having those talks, and what are the sort of topics that they should be discussing when they meet up?
Well, thank you, man. I'm glad you raised that point, that the CISO and the Chief Information Officer are really invaluable assets for a board in helping it to fulfill its responsibilities in terms of risk oversight and its fiduciary duties that we discussed earlier. Surveys show and evidence shows that companies with dedicated personnel detect more incidents and have a lower average cost per incident than companies that don't have dedicated resources. So the communication should be frequent, it should be regular, it should revolve around assisting a board in determining where the risks are, where the data is stored, how strong are the locks around the data, and who has the keys to the data. So those are the sorts of information that boards should be asking the personnel dedicated to cybersecurity, as well as incident response plans. Are there sufficient budget and resources dedicated to that effort? Is there appropriate insurance? What kind of insurance would the company need? And where are the risks? And are there third-party risks from vendors and others that may present risk? As well as in mergers and acquisitions and due diligence. Is the company doing the appropriate due diligence in its acquisitions to ensure it's not taking on risks it doesn't know about?
When they're having those talks, is it fairly... are there any keys to making sure the conversation, people are speaking the same language? You mentioned it's not people don't necessarily have to be technologists on the board, but obviously they want to be able to understand each other so they can trust it and move forward. Is there any tips for that? Just use plain English.
Certainly, education is important in training. It's a complex and ever changing world, but perhaps regular education and training is important. Some boards are starting to put cyber information experts on the board. Other boards, in fact, 42 out of the S&P 500 have a technology committee dedicated to overseeing cyber information and data-related issues. So there are a couple of ways to address that, but certainly education and communication are keys to that.
It's interesting, too. There's so much focus on educating the workforce in these enterprises, in these companies, and I think that's really important. But over the years, we forgot the board needs to be educated too, not to the level of sophistication in many instances that the real technical training down in the corporation, but that's one of the reasons that we decided to partner with NACD and Carnegie Mellon. You're probably familiar with the Wyndham case, right?
Yes.
Very interesting case. Ben, you probably are too, but there was an interesting intersection of both FTC looking at the company and it's a cottage industry of derivative litigators, right? It's a cottage industry. We know that happens all the time. But there are a lot of learnings from that legislation, and one of the reasons that the lawsuit failed is because there was regular interaction between the audit committee and not only the CISO and the CTO, but there was a record of that interaction, apparently a record of fairly knowledgeable interaction. But that wasn't the norm, and it still isn't the norm now. How does a board member, and you use the word, I think, Ben, the lexicon, what's the language mean? And let's just talk about it's not about a network. It affects your HR, it affects finance, it's merger and acquisition. There are so many elements to the cyber risk involvement in your business. We need to be better educated and focused as how we can have those conversations with that CISO. But by the way, at the end of the day, the CISO is not going to be challenged by the FTC, and the CISO is not going to be subject to the derivative lawsuit. It'll be the management and the board of directors.
But I think it goes to the level of risk that we're talking about. This is not just an IT issue, and I think you said that, Governor. This is an enterprise management risk. I mean, you've got to look at this across the entity. How are we looking at it from everything? David, your point on M&A is great. Third-party vendors, how are we looking at what are the potential avenues that someone could come after our company? And having that dialogue across the entire management team and looking at what are we doing? What is each individual business unit doing? And how are we looking at this collectively so that we can ensure that we can raise that level of confidence that we were talking about before, that we know that we're at least in a better position and can have the dialogue among the management team and the board to ensure that we're securing the enterprise.
And there are proactive steps that boards should be taking to ensure that it can demonstrate after an incident that it has taking steps to fulfill its obligations. And perhaps one place to look is this structure around financial reporting and financial reporting risk. Should there be a standalone committee? Should there be an outside expert akin to an independent audit firm that might come in on a regular basis and review the incident response plans? Should there be a designated expert on the board akin to the expert on the audit committee? Should there be management certification requirements, as there are now for management to certify financial statements? So there may be things that boards are already doing in other contexts that may be useful to show that it is fulfilling its obligations and fiduciary duties.
Are many companies, you talk about having an incident response plan, and is that something that you're seeing companies developing, or is that just an outlier? I mean, obviously it's a good practice, but how widely is that being taken up?
But again, I think if you look at this from an ERM standpoint, you're going to have a crisis response team within your company. What you've got to do is make sure you've got some people on that incident response team that can actually talk about this and can understand the implications of what might happen to the company and how they're going to address this, because you're not just addressing it to the shareholders. You're addressing it to your customers, you're addressing it to your employees, you're addressing it to law enforcement, and you've got to figure out exactly how that crisis response team is going to articulate what's happening within the company in a timely basis and in a wholesome basis. So.
Governor Ridge, what do you think for you are some of the key features of that recovery plan, that response plan? Are there any particular items that you recommend companies include?
Well, first of all, I think we ought to, every CEO and every board ought to subscribe to what I'm sure David tells your members. As somebody said years ago, two kinds of companies, those that are in breach that know it, and those that are in breach that don't know it. So you need to understand you can't create a fail-safe environment. You need to understand that you as a business are ultimately accountable and responsible for the securing your data, your IP, and the like. And so do you have a plan? First of all, do you have an enterprise-wide strategy to deal with it? Even my shop had conversations with multinational major organizations that had, well, they had the IT, they did their thing, and the HR did their thing, and the finance did their thing, but there was no, first of all, company-wide information and data security strategy, number one. But part of that strategy is, all right, if we are breached, and it's significant enough that we got to deal with 50 different states and reporting requirements and all the regulatory reporting requirements, what's our plan? What's the communication plan? Do we have somebody at the ready? If we break the glass, pull the handle, who or what entity do we get on there to make sure that we've identified the threat and try to block it? Who reaches out to the shareholders? Who's dealing with the regulators? And so the best advice is take a look at what you have. And in the era of global cybersecurity, it's a permanent challenge, and the risk continues to escalate as more and more people on the net, and you have more and more third parties involved in your system. You better have one and look at it, and it's not a static document. You better look at it periodically to make you ready to respond to a breach.
Who else? I mean, obviously, the
and you do it through counsel.
That's right.
Yes.
Good advice.
Always consult your lawyers. So if you have to deal with the CISO, the CIO, obviously very key players. But for the directors, who else internally are kind of useful for them to have like connections with? Would it be like in-house legal, compliance?
I think your entire management team, to Governor Ridge's point, is exactly the group that has to be involved. But you also got to have that third party. You got to have somebody that comes in and briefs the board on a regular basis to make sure you're not subject to asymmetric information risk, meaning you're only getting your information from inside the company. You need to have the latest trends. You need to know what's happening in the marketplace. What are the latest threats? So on occasion, and I'm not saying every board meeting, but once a year, twice a year, it might be worthwhile having a board or having an outside advisor come in and talk to the board and brief them on what's happening in the marketplace, broader than what's just focused on inside the company.
Right. And would they, those sorts of outside advisors, should they presumably also be involved in developing your response plan? Would they be part of when that plan goes into effect?
They can. They can. I mean, you may have a very good plan within your organization. That may be fine, but you might want to pressure test that plan with an outside source as well to make sure that the plan holds water, that you are, in fact, ensuring your most valuable assets. And again, to Governor Ridge's point, you're going to be breached. A breach is inevitable. It's what you do about it and how you respond to it. And what are you protecting? What can we ensure that we're locking up? The crown jewels of the organization are locked up. They are the most protected. And what can we mitigate? What damage can we mitigate through other sources, whether it's insurance, whether it's different security measures that we put in place. But it really is, how do we look at the entity?
And another way an outside party can help is by having a fire drill, a tabletop exercise.
Tabletops, yeah.
Okay.
And test the plan and find its weak points and address them before there's a real issue.
We've actually built one of those into the course so that you can...
We're talking very generically, but in this 16-hour course, we're going in much greater depth in all these subjects around the risk management, around the fiduciary duty that NACD knows so well. Actually, we've taken a lot of their work. They have a cybersecurity oversight handbook. We've integrated that product with a lot of work Carnegie Mellon has done, and that's how we get to our 16 hours, a very convenient way to upgrade your knowledge, to have a more thoughtful conversation, and maybe help even your management break down the stovepipes, encourage the development of a strategy, and start talking more seriously at the board level about a lot of the things that were being referenced in our conversation this morning.
So in terms of the course, are there any other units that maybe we haven't talked about that are core elements of that, or any other sort of aspects of that were worth, not all worth, that are going to be valuable to directors?
Well, I think the key with the course is that we framed it through a board lens. There are plenty of cybersecurity courses out there that management, IT, it depends on where you are in the organization. You can find a cybersecurity course that will give you some basics in how to address this. The partnership that we created with Carnegie Mellon and with Governor Ridge really took this and put the board lens on it. And that was the critical focus for us, as we're a membership organization for directors. That's what we do. Everything we do goes through the board lens. So shaping this course around what do the directors need to know? What is the core basics of the language, the lexicon that we were talking about? What are the incidences that they may have to respond to? And to have a tabletop exercise, a simulation that they can go through almost on a peer level via this course, and delivering it, as Governor Ridge said, they're busy folks. We had to deliver this so they could take it at their leisure when they wanted to, and to put some teeth behind it with an exam. If you want the certificate, you got to pass the exam. And
we like the tangible evidence. There's probably a lot of other online education programs out there, but NACD, Carnegie Mellon, complete the course, successfully complete the test. There's a tangible certificate said we're into this in a serious way, and obviously we think it'll facilitate a much better conversation between the board, and that during that section of the board meetings when there are a lot of risks they have to deal with, but right now I think it ranks right up there with financial risk. By the way, one could say if you don't manage your cyber shop, you are in great peril of even greater financial risk. So they kind of dovetail. Cyber risk and financial risk elevate to the same level, even though we don't have a Section 302 where the CEO and the CFO have to certify that they've had an audit. But one of these days, I think there may even be an audit requirement. The New York State Department of Financial Services and some of the regulators are starting to hint around about certain best practices. And would you be surprised, David, one of these days the government would say, hey, we got a financial audit? Maybe you better have a digital audit. I don't know who's going to do that. I mean, the federal government you question the federal government's ability to hold anybody accountable after the OPM breach. But you do know that the FTC, with its reasonableness standards, saying what has the company done based on its size and resources, et cetera, to lay out a cybersecurity plan and invest in making that company a more resilient enterprise.
But we've talked about this, Governor. We can't wait for the government to act.
Absolutely not.
It's too critical of an issue for companies and for boards. That's why we put the program together. We've got to get out ahead of this issue, and it always seems like the bad guys, so to speak, are 2 steps ahead of us. We've got to do more to help protect the company.
So government guidance, regulatory guidance would be helpful, you saying, in this area? Or?
Well, I think government guidance, look, the National Institute of Standards and Technology laid out a platform with 5 basic ingredients, fairly generic. They want companies to build a strategy, identify the threat, protect against the threat, detect the threat, respond and recover from the threat. That's all nice. But ultimately, the legal fiduciary responsibility to take care of you, your shareholders' interest, the products, the data, is with management and the board. And right now, it seems, Andrew, that most of the challenges that the government's more interested in being punitive than helpful. And you better not rely on even the hackers, and technology moves quicker than government. So do icebergs, but that's why you've got to be on top. It's a very dynamic environment, and you have to stay on top of it all the time.
Okay.
And I think a follow-on point to that is not only the company, but the board itself needs to be careful about its communications and its the data that it has in connection with acquisitions and strategy of the company. And it's as susceptible to incidents as the company is itself. So it needs to take steps not only to make sure the company is protected, but that it protects itself.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time. We could talk about this all day, but I'm afraid that's all the time we have so far this morning. So, again, Governor Ridge, excuse me, I'm having some form of cyber attack, apparently. So there we go. So Governor Ridge, Peter Gleason, and David Strandberg, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Ben.
And thank you all for watching live on Facebook. I'm Ben Maiden. This is NASDAQ Exclusives, and stay tuned for more. Goodbye.